Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny, and today I am starting my April reading wrap-up. I have 2 books to wrap up for you. The first one is a big arty one, which I'll only talk about really briefly. Beyond Wilderness, the Group of 7, Canadian Identity and Contemporary Art, edited by John O'Brien and Peter White. This book centers a lot on the Group of 7 because Canadian art history is very much influenced by the Group of 7. So they were 7 male artists working in the early 20th century. They defined a style of wilderness, in quotation mark, landscape painting that very much created an aesthetic that has continued in the Canadian mind as the aesthetic of the North, as the aesthetic of Canada, as the way Canada should be perceived. There's a lot of essays in this book that talk about how that's a false view, how it creates this romanticized version of Canada that is this like northern wilderness. And just out of frame of these paintings is the colonial machine working away at like logging and mining and different things like that aren't really brought into the picture and shown as the reality of the areas that these men were painting. They were mostly painting in Ontario and some in British Columbia. So there's essays that kind of challenge the views of the Canadian identity being tied to these artists specifically, and brings up the problematic nature of that in terms of Indigenous art, in terms of women's art, women artists, in terms of the people who were left out of the discussion. So I thought it was very good. There were a lot of really good essays in here that tackled some important questions that were certainly things that I was looking for around my current body of work. All right. So the other book I wanted to wrap up with you is my audiobook for the month, and it was called Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. Now, I think I'm going to do a full review on this book, so I'm only going to briefly touch on it here. But this is particularly a great audiobook because it is set on a fictional Welsh island. And so you get the full sense of the Welsh accent. The Welsh names are spoken aloud so you can hear the correct pronunciation. And it's also done in a really great style where there's some other narrators that come in to read some recordings of folklore, recordings of stories from the village on this island, and sing some folk songs. So you get to hear that, and they even change the intonation where you can hear that it's supposed to be this recording that was done in the late 1930s. The plot of this book is it follows a main young woman coming of age who has lived on this remote Welsh island her whole life. And with her father and her sister, her mother has died. And 2 anthropologist-style, sociologist-style academics come from Oxford to study the island. And she is kind of brought into their work because they know they can tell she's very intelligent and she knows how to speak English, and so they use her to help them translate different things and talk to the local people, and the plot ensues from there. So I'm not going to tell you any more about it here. I am going to tell you that I really enjoyed this book, and it was my first 5-star fiction listen and read of 2026. So that was really good. So do check out the review that I'm going to film that I have posted of this one, which I will link below. And I think it's a really worthwhile book, and I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it. I need to do a little bit more research on YouTube to see if anyone's reviewed it, but I think people should be talking about this book. Okay, so that's it for this check-in, and I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Hey everyone. Last night I finished All Fours by Miranda July. a book that has had a lot of opinions about it since it came out and won awards and been nominated for awards. And so here's my opinion on it. I think overall I did enjoy this book. So I had all the feels that a book can take you through, where I was like not enjoying it. I was annoyed by the main character. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's a lot of things about this book that I understand why someone wouldn't like. But I think as well, there's a fantastical element to it, or maybe for me, it doesn't feel like a very grounded novel. So while I think it's exploring a lot of grounded ideas, such as parenthood, traumatic birth, infidelity, repressed self, which is probably more of a theme that a lot of women writers and women characters explore. There's also a lot of privilege in this novel. The main character really has a life that feels very removed from reality in a lot of ways. So she kind of lives in her head a lot, and she doesn't have to work to contribute financially to her family. And I found at times that her ability to become obsessed with people and ideas was a product of that. So the fact that she didn't have to, she had a partner who ostensibly was carrying the load of supporting, like, financial matters are not mentioned in any way in this family. So there's a husband and wife and a child. And the relationship between the husband and wife, between our main character and our partner, is one that is in flux and changing. I thought the exploration of that was interesting in some regard. Having been through, a similar amount of time of 20 years with my own partner, though, I found their communication style to be rather bizarre, and their lack of, really pursuing like a depth conversation for some sort of a surface communication was very strange at times. I think that the overall theme of the novel and where the title comes from was very interesting. All fours being a grounded place to take adversity from, I think was, what she was getting at. And I found parts of this to be a bit repetitive and a bit annoying, but I didn't stop reading it because there was something there, I don't know, maybe a thread or a through line that I felt I wanted to follow through with, and I'm glad I did, because I did end up giving it 4 stars, and I think that it has a lot of merit in, discussing perimenopause. There's an ambiguity to some of it, and it doesn't feel like a realistic novel, and I know it doesn't have to. It's a novel. That's not what Miranda July was trying to do. So if you're willing to go on that journey and kind of pluck the little nuggets out of the story that help you, I don't know. I don't necessarily think a novel has to be that way, has to teach you anything, or you don't have to learn something, but you do want to understand what the theme is and where the novel's going. And I guess at times, the self-involvement of the main character, her kind of navel-gazing. I think if you don't like navel-gazing novels, then I would not recommend this one, because that's pretty much all it is. Got a bit much at times. Just felt a bit like, not maybe boring is the right word, but maybe lacking any like larger context about like other people in the world. So in her own self-reflections, she's not thinking about other types of mothers. She does think about other types of relationships, but in this very research way, this like gathering information way, and then you don't really like understand her reflection on those things. She's just like gathering the information. The plot, if you weren't aware of what the plot is that this semi-famous artist is supposed to drive on a road trip to New York, but she stops in a town about half an hour away from her home, and she redecorates a motel room and stays there and becomes obsessed with a young man. There's also a lot of the word masturbation in this novel. So I don't think I've ever read a novel that said masturbation as much as this one does. So if you don't like that, then I don't think you should read it. There are some pretty spicy scenes as well. That part of the exploration of like exploring sexual kinks or things like that is kind of in here. But I wouldn't say it was as wild as people made it out to be in the reviews that I saw before I read this. So, take that with a grain of salt as you come to it. And what ends up happening for this woman is she realizes that where she is in her life is in middle age, perimenopausal, and that she needs more to be herself, to truly be who she is in relation to her partner, in relation to her child. And she comes through that journey and finds something that is her normal. So yeah, that's All Fours by Miranda July. Hey everybody. So I just finished Northern Light, the Enduring Mystery of Tom Thomson and the Woman Who Loved Him by Roy MacGregor. Okay, so this is probably as close as I'm ever going to get to reading true crime willingly. I have read a couple true crimes for book prizes before, for the Book 2 prize, but I don't choose those types of books very much. So in case you're not familiar, Tom Thomson was an early 20th century artist, Canadian artist, who worked in Ontario in an area called Algonquin Park, which is north of Toronto. And at the time, in the early 20th century, it was very much a mill area. So they were milling wood for timber, and they were also developing a kind of tourism industry around fishing, hunting, and there were lots of cottages up there, lodges, etc. So at that time, Tom Thomson was working in Toronto in the winter, and then he would go up there in the spring and summer and paint. And he became somewhat of he has become an enigmatic figure in Canadian art because he died in the summer of 1917, and his death was mysterious, and it remains mysterious to this day for insanely complex, layered reasons, which are all outlined in the book by Roy MacGregor. So this is my second book by Roy MacGregor. I really enjoy his style of writing. He's also written a novel about this, which I actually have as well. So I probably will be reading it sometime later this year, and then I might do a comparison video between the two books. But this book is jam-packed because Roy MacGregor grew up in Huntsville, which is the town near Algonquin. He knew about this mystery his whole life. He knew people who knew Tom Thomson. His great aunt, I believe, was a love interest of Tom Thomson. And so the woman who loved him is Winnie Trainor, who her life was, altered completely when he died. So the official record says that he drowned. The crazy amounts of evidence and hearsay and rumors and bodies being exhumed and coffins being moved, and it's quite an intriguing story. It still has not been really settled because the Thompson family refused to have the body that they believe, the coffin and the grave where they believe Tom's body was moved to, exhumed, to prove it. So nobody knows for sure where he is. And nobody knows for sure how he died, because the circumstances were not consistent with drowning in a lot of ways. There were a lot of shady things that happened around the day that he disappeared, and a lot of people who could have, for whatever reason, killed him or wanted him to die for various reasons. Anyway, it's all in the book. It's very... The only criticism I have of the book is because of a book of this nature, where you're constantly talking about different theories and different people who had said different things that are inconsistent with other stories. There's a lot of repetition in that part. So, you might remember this one thing, but he has to repeat it in order to make his through line of what he thinks happened or whatever consistent, so that you remember as the reader. And I have to say that his conclusion was not one that I necessarily agree with, because Tom Thompson is now larger than life. Like, he is by far more famous and popular than the group of seven, which were artists who he knew and who he potentially would have joined into their group if he would have lived past 1917. It's that thing that happens in popular culture, where if a figure dies at a certain age kind of tragically and is cut off earlier, their legacy is much more potent. There's like a level of that feeling of like, this person could have been the best and the greatest, and they were cut off at this moment of brilliance, and what would they have been if they had continued. It keeps their memory and their legend much bigger and broader than someone who eventually stops painting and becomes an old person and kind of fades off into the distance. That Neil Young quote, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." Definitely think in Tom Thompson's case, he is more famous than he would have been if he would have kept living. Potentially, who knows? But it's one of those mysteries you can never solve, because he died. So Roy MacGregor, kind of concludes by saying that, what actually happened to him doesn't actually matter, because the mystery and the rumor and that's keeping people talking about him. So that's more important than what actually happened. I actually feel like that is not true. Like, to me, I want to know where he really is and what really happened to him, especially if he was murdered, because I feel like, people who are murdered deserve justice for their death. And even if the people who committed it have passed away, which they most certainly have at this point in time, it is, I don't know, I feel like it's his due. It's his, he deserves to rest, and his family and his descendants and society at large deserve an explanation for what happened to this man and how it went down. Or maybe it's just my unending curiosity that I want to know. But yeah, so that is Northern Light by Roy MacGregor. And I will check in again with you when I have finished another book. Everybody. All right, I just finished Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier this morning. And this was just a fantastic read. I fell in love with Inman, the main character, one of the main characters. And funny caveat to this is that I mixed up this novel with another novel set during the Civil War, or with another film set during the Civil War, which is The Beguiled, both starring Nicole Kidman. I got confused. So the plot of this was actually an earlier movie, so when I described it in my TBR, I was describing the wrong plot. But this is set on Cold Mountain, North Carolina, Civil War, late Civil War, and through most of it, because Inman is in the town, and he and Ada are drawn to each other, and he goes and enlists, and it is his story, starting from when he's convalescing in a hospital, recovering from a wound, of trying to get back to her. And it's her story of trying to survive, being this genteel Southern woman who was coddled by her father. And she has to find her reserves and become someone who can survive and take care of herself. And you're mostly taking those two journeys, his journey back through the mountains, tons of adventures, tons of challenges, and her adventures with a young woman named Ruby, who comes to live with her and decides that they're going to be friends and they're going to co-run this farm together. And that is, to me, a perfect formula for creating beautiful relationships. You know, there's lots of plot, there's lots of action, but there's also these deep connections between these people. Ada and Inman do want to be together, but they face so much, and it's set during a time of war. It's a difficult time. It shows this kind of time out of time that happens when there's a huge conflict that is, what would have happened if they would have come together when there wasn't a war? Who would they have been? All those questions are kind of looked at in here. Beautiful nature writing, stunningly deep character encounters, especially for Inman. Fell deeply for Inman. Just an incredible character with just so much integrity, and Ada as well, and Ruby as well. They're all just great characters. A very bittersweet ending. And yeah, I just thought this was fantastic. I will be talking more about this in a future video. But yeah, I'm so glad I read this. 5 stars. That is the end of my reading wrap up for April. Thanks so much for watching, and I will be back again soon with another video.